Good afternoon and welcome to all of you. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Susan Ackerman and I'm the president of ASOR, the American Schools of Oriental Research. And on behalf of ASOR, it's my great pleasure to be able to welcome you here today. This is an extremely exciting event for ASOR to be able to present to you today some of the interim results of our Syrian Heritage Initiative. The initiative began officially on August 4th of this year, 2014. So this is an opportunity to see where we are about 3.5 or 4 months into the initiative. For me, when I think about this initiative, I go back actually not to think to August 4th, but I think of January. I had just assumed the office of ASOR president as of January 1st, 2014, and shortly thereafter, I went to spend a day in our Boston offices to talk with our staff about their work and about their vision for ASOR. As part of that conversation, we discussed how ASOR was perceived beyond the walls of our Boston office and what people thought when they heard of us. One of our staff members reported that what she experienced was a somewhat disconcerting disconnect. She would tell her friends that she worked for a nonprofit. They would respond, "Oh, a nonprofit. You must be working to save the world." And she would say, "Well, we do archaeology." But I'd respond a little differently. ASOR does do what it can to save the world by helping save for the world some of its richest cultural heritage. Traditionally, we've done that through our work as archaeologists to uncover that heritage, and through our work as interpreters of the past to promote greater understanding of that heritage. But the Syrian Heritage Initiative allows us to help save for the world some of its richest cultural heritage in another way, by doing what we can to help safeguard heritage sites in Syria and also now in the parts of northern Iraq under the control of the Islamic State. Now, to be sure, the initial part of our work to document the damage being done to Syrian and northern Iraqi heritage sites doesn't exactly sound like we're saving those sites. But that documentation is done in support of two other components of our initiative: to use what we've found regarding the degradation of cultural heritage sites to raise national and international awareness, and so to help mobilize as many partners as we can in our fight to safeguard Syria's and northern Iraq's cultural patrimony. And second, we hope to plan some short-term and long-term mitigation projects that we can implement in a process of safeguarding and restoration. In closing, let me speak of the peoples of Syria and northern Iraq. For while I've spoken of saving the world and saving the world's cultural heritage, more important is to save Syria's and Iraq's cultural heritage for the Syrian and for the Iraqi people. Right now, in the midst of the region's grave humanitarian crisis, we all think most of the profound need for the most basic necessities for survival to be met: food, shelter, security. But cultural heritage and what it means for a sense of cultural identity, cultural pride, and in a region with such a multifaceted past, what it means for helping cultures today to live together is an essential component of a culture's health and well-being. ASOR is thus very, very proud of the work we are endeavoring to do to save the remains of the past and help in that way to make the war-torn worlds in which Syrians and Iraqis live today come back to being whole. Thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to introduce the chairman of the board of the American Schools of Oriental Research, B.W. Ruffner.
Very briefly, let me just add my welcome, and we're happy to have you here. And for me, I have to say that this is really a bittersweet experience for me. Over the last 10 years, I've spent probably 2.5 weeks in Syria. And when I look back at my photographs of Mari or Dura Europa or Aleppo, I can't help wondering just what they look like today. And we're going to hear a little bit about that in just a minute. But probably the most painful thing about me looking back at my photographs is to discover that probably a third of them have children in them. And wondering where those kids are today, whether they're alive or not, is painful for me, and I'm sure it is for you as well. What we do is a small part of the effort to help eventually rebuild that country, we all hope. And thank you for joining us today to learn a little bit more about it. And it's now my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Catherine Foster, who is a cultural property analyst for the State Department. Catherine?
Thank you. 9 millennia of civilization in Syria has produced some of the world's most spectacular cultural heritage, from the remains of immense Bronze and Iron Age cities to extensive Greek and Roman metropolises, well-preserved rural Byzantine towns, breathtaking medieval castles, and masterpieces of Islamic art and architecture. 6 of Syria's heritage sites are on UNESCO's World Heritage List, and 12 more have been nominated for inclusion. The ongoing conflict in Syria is having a devastating impact on the welfare of the Syrian people and the heritage they treasure. Many cultural landmarks, including World Heritage sites, have been damaged or destroyed, while archaeological sites have been ruthlessly and systematically plundered. The United States strongly supports efforts to preserve Syria's cultural heritage and continues to call on all parties to the conflict to respect and protect Syrian cultural sites, including museums, archives, and places of archaeological, historic, and religious significance. The destruction of Syria's rich cultural heritage represents not only irrevocable loss for humanity, but also jeopardizes the role it can play in post-conflict reconciliation and economic revitalization efforts. In the words of Ann Richards, Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, when we help protect heritage sites or preserve cultural objects throughout the world, we also support a nation's efforts to restore its national identity. Citizens of all ethnicities, faiths, backgrounds, and economic stations can feel the pride and sense of national unity that comes with that. We are also supporting the potential rebirth of an economy which, at one time, accounted for 12% of Syria's gross domestic product and generated more than $6.5 billion a year. In fact, 11% of the workforce was employed as conservation professionals, teachers, tour guides, museum curators, hotel owners and employees, travel agents, bus and coach drivers, and shopkeepers. The U.S. Department of State has shown America's commitment to helping Syrians preserve their priceless heritage through a variety of projects, including close monitoring of looting at archaeological sites, which revealed pillage of an unimaginable scale at the ancient city of Dura Europa, for example, compiling a map and inventory of more than 1,000 major Syrian heritage sites, 90% of which are located in areas of conflict and displacement, and supporting the production of the emergency red list of Syrian cultural objects at risk, which serves as a tool for international law enforcement to identify types of Syrian artifacts subject to trafficking. Our latest initiative to date is a $600,000 cooperative agreement with the American Schools of Oriental Research to comprehensively document the current condition of cultural heritage sites in Syria and assess the future restoration, preservation, and protection needs for those sites. ASOR's documentation and planning is raising global awareness of the threats to Syria's cultural heritage and identifying immediate and future preservation projects and assistance that can be carried out inside Syria when circumstances permit. This cooperative agreement is jointly managed by the State Department's Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs, Office of Press and Public Diplomacy, and the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, Cultural Heritage Center. In response to the widespread destruction of cultural heritage in Iraq by terrorists under the banner of the so-called Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL, Secretary of State John Kerry announced that an additional $156,000 in funding has been provided to expand the ASOR project to include monitoring and documentation of threats to heritage in ISIL-controlled areas of Iraq. This expanded project joins other State Department initiatives that over the last decade have included the establishment of the Iraqi Institute for the Conservation of Antiquities and Heritage in Erbil, now in its 6th year of operation, the Future of Babylon project, in which the U.S. is working with Iraqi partners to develop long-term management planning and immediate preservation interventions at the site of ancient Babylon. These efforts are best summarized by Secretary Kerry in remarks delivered recently at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. President Obama and our administration are laser-focused on protecting the cultural heritage of countries all over the world. Our heritage is in peril in this very moment, and we believe it is imperative that we act now. We do so knowing that our leadership, the leadership of the United States, can make a difference, and that the fight to protect the cultural heritage of Iraq and Syria isn't just about shared values. It's about protecting a shared legacy. It's now my pleasure to call to the podium Dr. Michael Donte, who's the co-director of the ASOR Cultural Heritage Initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, and it's very good to be here today. When people ask what it's like participating in ASOR's new Cultural Heritage Initiative, monitoring the heritage situation in Syria and northern Iraq, our first response is generally to say challenging, since the destruction really never sleeps. Like other facets of the humanitarian crisis, the devastation in Syria and Iraq seemingly is never ending and is utterly disheartening. I think all cultural heritage experts working on the same or similar crises understand exactly what I mean. In recent years, the international community has witnessed a sharp escalation in cultural property crises following the instabilities of the Arab Spring movement, widespread terrorism, extremist violence, and insurgencies across parts of Africa and Southwest Asia. We've seen the outbreak of hostilities in Syria, the Ukraine, and Iraq. The scale of the efforts necessary to address these crises is staggering, and the challenges come fast on the heels of massive reconstruction efforts linked to previous conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. Looting and combat destruction have claimed whole museums in Ukraine, Syria, and Iraq. Here we see the Donetsk Local History Museum in Ukraine, which was destroyed amid the hostilities there recently. Museum staffs and heritage professionals in these countries are often divided along political lines, having to choose between professionalism and patriotism in the conflict. In Mali, collections of medieval manuscripts in Timbuktu have been callously burned by Islamist rebels of the Ansar Dine organization. Here we see the terrible state of the Ahmed Baba Institute. The wars being waged all too often target cultural heritage for complex sets of tactical, strategic, and ideological reasons. Mosques, tombs, shrines, and churches have been systematically destroyed across North Africa and the Middle East. In this photo, Libyan Islamists destroy the mausoleum of Al-Shab al-Dahman in Tripoli. Such intentional destructions of heritage are perhaps the most appalling and flagrant cultural property crime and are becoming all too common, especially in Syria and Iraq. In some, these cultural property crimes deepen sectarian divisions, foment further violence, fund terrorist organizations, and threaten to undermine future peace, prosperity, and stability. These Palmyrene funerary sculptures stolen in Syria are one small part of a massive trade in stolen antiquities. Last week, I was fortunate to attend the annual meeting of the Blue Shield Netherlands in Doorn on the 60th anniversary of the 1954 Hague Convention. The Blue Shield organization is well known for marking of sites of cultural significance with a blue and white shield to protect them during times of instability and conflict. At this gathering of heritage experts, military personnel, and concerned citizens, we heard desperate pleas for additional assistance from heritage experts from Mali, Ukraine, Syria, and elsewhere. All were agreed that the international community suffered from a certain degree of fatigue, given the scale of the challenges at hand and the seemingly never-ending stream of humanitarian crises wrought by conflict, pandemics, and natural disasters. There was also a general consensus that current treaties and international and domestic laws to protect cultural property needed strengthening, since most were designed for World War II-style conflicts characterized by state actors, clearly defined country versus country conflict dynamics. Here we see the famous monuments men of World War II. The story has recently recaptured the public's attention for cultural property protection. There are calls to expand such efforts today, but the current situation is quite different, I'm sure, as most of you know. Non-state actors, extremists in terrorism, proxy forces, and hybrid wars characterize current conflicts, making the preservation of heritage in conflict much more difficult. Blatant disregard for international law and treaties are now the norm. Here we see fighters of the Islamic State who now control roughly 1/3 of Syria and Iraq. At Doorn, there was talk of a new third protocol to the Hague Convention, or perhaps something completely new to address modern challenges. All were agreed that a proactive stance and better risk management were quintessential, and yet most often wholly lacking in the areas of current conflict. Many options disappear once conflict ensues, and there is a tendency at that point to slip into a reactive mode. I will return to the issue of new policies later, but let's move on to today's focus. Today we turn to the appalling devastation of cultural heritage in Syria and Iraq, and especially the looting of cultural property from archaeological sites, cultural repositories, and private citizens, which often gets overlooked. Currently, the news media and public are well aware of the terrible impacts of looting in this region, but there are many unanswered questions. Here we see damage at the Aleppo Medicine and Science Museum, the Bimaristan Argun in Syria. Such devastation is all too familiar sight. In recent weeks, public attention has shifted somewhat from a focus on the terrible impacts of cultural property crimes on our shared global patrimony, what I would call the cultural costs, to important investigations of the role of looting and trafficking in financing extremist organizations, the monetary value. Most experts agree that extremist organizations such as Jabhat al-Nusra and the so-called Islamic State or ISIL derive substantial and reliable revenue from from property theft, which includes looting archaeological sites, museums, and other repositories, as well as stealing ethnographic materials and art from private citizens. Our discussions with the media, particularly teams of investigative reporters now in Turkey and Jordan, make it very clear that international attention is squarely on the trafficking of antiquities by extremists in Iraq and Syria and on terrorist finances. To be sure, the topic of looting is sadly far too large to fully cover in short news stories or, for that matter, in this presentation today, and I will proceed by attempting to address the most frequently asked questions. This is looting, by the way, at the site of Ebla. So first question, who and where? So our first questions on the topic of Syria and Iraq generally are who is looting and where is it happening, in whose territory? I hear this all the time. The answer is that, quite simply, all major belligerents in the conflict engage in looting or are complicit in tolerating or facilitating it in their territories. Looting occurs virtually everywhere. Our presentations later today by Jesse Cassana and Scott Branting on satellite remote sensing can better address this. Here we see the militarization of the large archaeological mound of Tel Jafar in Syria and looter holes dotting the site. A military presence and looting often go hand in hand. While ASOR SHI, or CHI, is documenting looting everywhere, it's worst in areas controlled by extremists in the north and east of Syria, that is, in ISIL and increasingly al-Nusra Front territory. However, it's important to note that this pattern matches that of pre-war looting, so it's an already established pattern before the conflict. Nevertheless, since the outbreak of hostilities, looting has become far worse at a very alarming rate. Some of the worst cases of looting documented to date are examples of opportunistic looting. The collapse of the rule of law and the militarization of archaeological sites like Palmyra and Aphamia, shown here in before and after photos. These world-famous cities of the Hellenistic and Roman periods have exposed them to pillage. In these examples, forces associated with the Syrian regime are the most likely suspects based on timing and opportunity. Most of the looting in Syria and Iraq qualifies as subsistence looting. Here we see the devastation of the famous Bronze Age city of Mari on the Euphrates River in Syria, home to the famous palace of King Zimri-Lim. The red areas are looted, and the white building in the major red area is the roof over the palace. We can reliably conclude that out of desperation, locals are bartering away their heritage for pennies on the dollar to middlemen who are the real culprits in all of this. In this case, the middlemen are probably the major local belligerent, almost certainly ISIL. Average everyday Syrians and Iraqis are looting archaeological sites near their settlements out of desperation to feed their families and heat their homes in winter. Subsistence looting forms the roots of a looting hierarchy in so-called blood antiquities, stretching from the towns and villages of Syria and Iraq through extremist groups and organized crime syndicates, to antiquities dealers, and finally, in the end, to museums with questionable acquisition practices, as well as unscrupulous private collectors. Extremists in Syria and Iraq fund their radical activities through the extraction of Syria and Iraq's cultural patrimony and their future. In turn, their violent and radical actions exacerbate the humanitarian crisis and heighten the conflict, and the circle of destruction deepens and quickens. How is looting organized? In some cases, extremists simply do nothing to stop looting. In the worst cases, extremist organizations provide capacity and incentives for large-scale looting and control the traffic. Here we see the site of Dura Europos in Syria, which is under ISIL control. Extremists sometimes do the looting themselves, but more often they hire others to loot for them or they tax looting. Essentially, their approach is quite flexible, but ultimately they can count on most stolen cultural property passing through their hands. Regime forces and extremist groups control the transportation system and border crossings and are engaged in the smuggling of oil, weapons, and people. Illicit cultural property rides these same routes to Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan before moving on to the main market points. We are often asked how looters operate. In the pre-war period, looting was generally done at night by small groups with simple tools, picks and shovels. Looters still use these same methods, but can dig by the light of day in groups numbering in the hundreds. Metal detectors are used to search for finds, as seen here at the site of Tel Hizarin in Syria. And heavy machinery, such as backhoes and bulldozers, can be brought in to rapidly rip open archaeological sites. This has been documented in many places. Here we see damage at the site of Ebla in Syria, where they've cut into the side of a mound with a bulldozer. So what are looters stealing? It's a frequent question. And the simple answer is whatever they can lay their hands on. In some of the most egregious examples, extremists have looted museums and archaeological storehouses. Details of these thefts are difficult to obtain. The Raqqa Museum and Storage Facility in northern Syria are one of the best known examples. There are increasing numbers of reports that other museums are possibly being looted by ISIL. Extremists also pillage the cultural property of their ethnic and religious opponents, whom they view as apostates. Kurds, Yazidis, Christians, and Shia Muslims have been repeatedly targeted by ISIL and other extremists. Occasionally, officials in Syria have seized shipments of stolen antiquities, and occasionally we see items that clearly come from recently looted sites. This small head of a limestone votive sculpture is the most recent photo to cross my desk. I was asked by Syrian heritage experts to verify the authenticity of this object from a photo, which is obviously extremely difficult. It is almost certainly genuine and, based on the style, comes from the site of Mari and dates to the early dynastic period or early Bronze Age or the 3rd millennium BC. I wonder how much more material like this has been stolen from Mari, given the extent of the digging there that we saw in the previous photo. How much is looting worth? There are a few fixed points for trying to determine the revenues extremist organizations derive from cultural property crimes, generally. I would emphasize here again that dollar values also distract from the deleterious cultural impacts of looting, but there's a need to understand the contributions of looting to extremists for matters of security and for risk management. The most recent listing of ISIL finances by Undersecretary David Cohen lists oil sales, kidnapping and ransom, extortion, and crime generally, which includes bank robbery, archaeological looting, and other forms of theft and human trafficking. These are all important sources of revenue. A recent UN monitoring report lists revenues slightly different, with oil sales, extortion and theft, antiquities, kidnapping and ransom, donations, and other sources. In both assessments, antiquities looting is specifically mentioned, and it is important to point out that the category theft includes the theft of valuable cultural property from institutions and individuals. There is some lumping of cultural property crime in these estimates, and all sources are quick to point out these are in fact only estimates. Fixating on the exact dollar value of looting, which we will likely never know, amounts to debating whether looting is very horrific or merely horrific. It's very horrific, and the international community must act now or we risk repeating the mistakes of the past. Other gauges of the antiquities trade strongly suggest marked increases in material from Syria reaching the market. A recent study by Rick St. Hilaire found that imports of Syrian antiquities to the United States rose 133% between 2012 and 2013, and 672% for Iraq over the same period. The burning question obviously becomes how much of this spike could be illicit antiquities. These numbers are all the more distressing upon reflecting on the fact that dealers generally hold on to looted antiquities and illicit cultural property for many years before transporting and marketing it. We are only seeing a small fraction of huge masses of stolen material. Moreover, much of it will never reach public marketplaces and will go directly to private collections. Note the Islamic State flag. Cultural property crimes have other benefits for extremist organizations. If it is to endure, ISIL must appeal to Sunni Muslims in its core area of Mosul and Raqqa. The organization must assume the trappings of a functioning government, administering its territories and providing services, which costs a great deal. Moreover, the organization's expanding military has created additional financial burdens. The old criminal revenue streams, such as kidnapping, extortion, and theft, undermine ISIL objectives of forming a viable state and risk the kind of tribal uprisings that dealt al-Qaeda in Iraq, ISIL's predecessor, a severe blow while operating in Al-Anbar province. ISIL's recent punitive atrocities against tribal populations show they recognize tribal uprisings as an Achilles heel. Over the short term, revenues from antiquities looting might provide one means of alleviating some of the financial pressure. ISIL must also find methods for employing those living within its territories, and our sources indicate the two largest and most lucrative areas of employment are working for ISIL in oil and antiquities looting. Why the Islamic State focus? Obviously, all cultural property crime is important to ASOR's cultural heritage initiatives. However, ISIL currently represents a high priority for international efforts because ISIL extremists are waging an overt war on culture. The organization seeks to stamp out cultural diversity and impose its own radical interpretation of Islam over a vast area. To do this, the organization will destroy any heritage it deems counter to its aims. Here we see the destruction of the tomb of Yahya Abul Qasim in Nineveh province of Iraq by ISIL. ISIL also views cultural heritage as a legitimate, religiously justified monetary resource. The organization has closed archaeological departments and other cultural programs that it deems unfit in universities under its control. Some of the things that are being done about this. Recently, legislation has been introduced in the United States to address these problems. The Engel-Smith Act, also known as the Protect and Preserve International Cultural Property Act, would empower the President to appoint a White House coordinator for international cultural property protection. This would coordinate efforts across the federal government and promote cultural preservation. It would also authorize the Secretary of State to make grants to private individuals or organizations for the purpose of international cultural property protection in at-risk areas. The act would also impose restrictions on archaeological and ethnological materials from Syria as if Syria were a state party to the Convention on the Cultural Property Implementation Act to cut down on the trafficking and the sale of so-called blood antiquities. A recent set of recommendations by the United Nations Security Council Sanctions Monitoring Team, dated 13 November 2014, requests the United Nations Security Council to, quote, mandate a worldwide moratorium on the trading of antiquities from the Syrian Arab Republic or Iraq since the passing of Resolution 2170 that lack clear certified provenance. Let's hope these are just the first of many national and international efforts to help to preserve the irreplaceable cultural heritage of Syria and Iraq for future generations. Thank you very much.